I rise as a proud American who has the distinct honor of serving in this great body. As a member of Congress, we take an oath to defend the Constitution because at times it needs defending. On January 6th, the nation watched as insurrectionists stormed the Capitol, threatening the safety of countless individuals and successfully, albeit temporarily, disrupting our process. In the midst of the attack, hundreds of Capitol police officers heroically upheld their duty to defend the United States and protect those who work here. Many officers were severely injured and beaten, including one of my former interns. And tragically, one officer, Officer Brian Sicknick, succumbed to the injuries he sustained.
Welcome to Dr. John Podcast. So this is happening right now. The specific documented pattern of Republicans themselves turning on Donald Trump in ways that have only happened once before in his political career. And that once before tells us exactly what comes next. We have a historical template. After January 6th, Republican figures went on record demanding Trump's resignation. Phil Scott.
For more on the growing 2024 GOP field, let's bring in our newest ABC News contributor, former Republican Congressman John Katko of New York. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. First, let me just get your reaction to former Governor Christie jumping into this race and whether you think that he has a viable shot at winning over GOP voters.
Well, I think the conventional wisdom is that the more competitors for the President Trump, the better it helps him. But I think that's 2016 logic. I think this race is going to be wide open, and there's a long way to go. And let's not forget, back in 2016, around this time, President Trump was in the single digits himself. So
John Katko, two Republican senators whose names you can still find in the congressional record. They did it when the political cost of standing with Trump became higher than the cost of demanding he go. That is the template. That is the precedent. And right now, that same political cost calculation is being activated by something else entirely. The Iran war. 13 Americans dead, 230 wounded. 54% of voters disapproving. A leaked document showing a 100-day operational planning horizon stretching through the midterms, and a MAGA national security hero resigning in protest, saying Iran posed no imminent threat and that the war was driven by lobbyists. This is not speculation about what might happen. This is the documented convergence of everything that produced Republican resignation demands after January 6th happening again right now. And the man at the center of it all knows exactly what that means. He told House Republicans privately that if they lose the midterms, he will be impeached. He said Democrats will surely find a reason to remove him if they gain control. He was warning them about the political consequences of losing the House. But what he didn't anticipate is that the pressure might not wait for the midterms, that the fracture in his own coalition might produce the accountability before the election even happens. Let me walk you through exactly what's happening, why the historical template matters so much, and why the rain ends framing is not hyperbole. It's the most accurate description available of what the documented evidence is pointing toward. Let's start with the historical template. After January 6th, Republican officials did something that almost never happens in modern American politics. They went on the record demanding that a president from their own party resign. Phil Scott, the Republican governor of Vermont, John Katko, a Republican congressman from New York, and two Republican senators who publicly urged Trump to resign immediately as part of a larger push to bar him from ever holding office again. These were not moderate Republicans who were never aligned with Trump. Scott was a governor. Katko was a congressman. The senators were members of the same party whose continued support Trump needed to survive. Their willingness to go on record demanding resignation established the specific historical precedent that matters right now. It showed that Republican members are capable of making the most dramatically anti-Trump political statement when the political cost calculation produces that conclusion. And here's the key. It wasn't about principle independent of politics. It wasn't about bipartisan coordination with Democrats. It was about political cost calculation, the specific assessment that the cost of continued association with Trump had exceeded the cost of the most dramatically available disassociation in their specific electoral environments. That is the template, and the Iran war is replicating the conditions that produced it. Now let's talk about the MAGA fracture, because the most significant resignation in this entire story is not from some anti-Trump Republican. It's from one of Trump's own people. Joe Kent was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He was a MAGA hero. He was the most prominent national security official in the movement, and he resigned over the Iran war, not quietly, not with diplomatic language. He specifically said Iran posed no imminent threat. He said Trump started the conflict under pressure from Israel and its American allies. He said the no no more endless wars promise had been violated. The Washington Post and The Hill both reported that Kent's protest highlights deep unease among the No More Endless Wars wing of Trump's base. That wing is not some fringe group. The No More Endless Wars commitment was one of the most central foreign policy promises of the entire MAGA movement. It was the specific assertion that Trump represented a fundamental break from the Bush-era Republican tradition that produced the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It was the foreign policy credential that most directly distinguished the MAGA movement from the establishment Republican foreign policy it was defining itself against. And now that promise has been violated in the most dramatically visible way. Iran is in its third week. The leaked documents show a 100-day operational planning horizon stretching through the midterms. 13 Americans dead, 230 wounded. This is not a quick strike, this is a war. And the war is happening while the movement's most credentialed national security official is on the record saying it was unnecessary and lobby-driven. Kent's resignation creates something specific. It creates permission. A Republican member who demands Trump resign over the Iran war without the Kent resignation risks being labeled as establishment opposition. A Republican member who demands Trump resign, citing Kent's inside account of no imminent threat and lobby-driven war, is making the accountability demand in the most MAGA-credentialed format available. The same format the most prominent MAGA national security official used when he made the same accountability judgment. That permission structure lowers the cost of resignation demands in the specific electoral environments where the MAGA credential is most essential for political survival. Now let's talk about what Republican leaders are doing in response to all of this. The New York Times documented that GOP leaders are deferring to Trump on Iran. They are resisting even basic public hearings. Why? Because they fear exposing a lack of strategy and internal division. That is the specific phrase. Fear of exposing a lack of strategy and internal division. They are blocking transparency because they know that public hearings would document the strategic incoherence that lawmakers are already describing privately. They know it would expose the lurching objectives and the absence of a coherent plan. This blocking strategy is the most specifically self-defeating political calculation in the current environment. Here's why. Republican members in competitive districts where the 54% voter disapproval of Trump's Iran handling is most politically consequential have the most specific incentive to create documented public distance from the war. They need to establish an independent judgment record through accountability demands, public hearings, war powers votes, something they can point to when their opponents make the accountability argument against them in the campaign. The blocking strategy prevents those members from creating that record. It requires them to make the most unified pro-war posture in the specific electoral environment where that posture is most politically costly. It is therefore most specifically harmful to the most vulnerable members. And its continuation is the political dynamic most directly building toward the House flip that Trump privately acknowledged would mean certain impeachment. Because here's the thing Trump knows. He told House Republicans that if they lose the midterms, he will be impeached. He said Democrats will surely find a reason to remove him if they gain control. That private warning is the most specific available confirmation that the Republican protection in Congress is the only remaining shield between the accumulated accountability case and the formal proceedings that case supports. And the blocking strategy that is supposed to protect that shield is actually accelerating the conditions that will remove it. Let me give you 4 clear points that capture exactly what's happening and why it matters. The January 6th historical template is the single most consequential precedent for understanding what's happening now. Phil Scott, John Katko, and 2 Republican senators publicly demanding Trump's resignation established through documented evidence that Republican resignation demands are not hypothetical future possibilities. They are historically established political behaviors with specific identified triggering conditions. Those triggering conditions are simple. Republican members go on record demanding resignation when the specific political cost of continued association with Trump has demonstrably exceeded the political cost of the most dramatically available disassociation in their specific electoral environments. That is the empirically established threshold. And right now, the Iran war is producing the same political cost calculation that crossed that threshold after January 6th. Joe Kent's resignation is the single most consequential MAGA fracture signal. When the most prominent MAGA national security official resigns and says the war was unnecessary and lobby-driven, it establishes from the most credentialed available inside source that the foundational foreign policy promise of the movement has been violated. That creates a permission structure. A Republican member who demands Trump resign over the Iran war without the Kent resignation risks being labeled as establishment opposition. A Republican member who demands Trump resign citing Kent's inside account is making the accountability demand in the most MAGA credentialed format available. The permission structure lowers the cost of resignation demands in the electoral environments where the MAGA credential is most essential. The Republican blocking strategy, resisting basic Iran hearings because of fear of exposing lack of strategy and internal division, is the most specifically self-defeating political calculation in the current midterm environment. Members in competitive districts where the war's unpopularity is most politically consequential need to create documented public distance from the war through accountability demands. The blocking strategy prevents them from creating that record while requiring them to make the most unified pro-war posture in the environment where that posture is most costly. It maximizes short-term unity preservation at the direct expense of the long-term accountability that would most directly protect competitive district members from the most severe midterm consequences. Here's what we need to watch as this story continues to develop. The Iran war political cost trajectory, whether additional casualties, additional strategic failures, and the continued absence of a clear exit plan produce the specific accumulation of political cost that crosses the January 6th template threshold for additional named Republican members is the single most consequential pending variable. The Republican crossover arithmetic, whether the MAGA fracture produces additional named Republican House and Senate members willing to make the specific public accountability demands that most directly establish the historical template's triggering conditions in the current environment, will determine whether the reign ends framing describes a near-future accountability endpoint or a more distant reckoning. The hearing demand resolution, whether the procedural pressure produces a specific Republican willingness to hold public Iran hearings that most directly expose the strategic incoherence and the leaked long war planning horizon on the most consequential available public record, will determine whether the accountability that the blocking strategy is currently preventing eventually reaches the specific public exposure that most directly accelerates the political cost calculation for Republican members. And the electoral outcome, whether the accumulated Iran war costs, the MAGA fracture, the leaked planning documents, and the overall accountability pressure together, produce the specific electoral conditions that most directly affect the House majority composition, will determine whether the Republicans demand resignation. Framing describes a political accountability demand that precedes or follows the electoral outcome that Trump's private certainty identifies as the most specific available trigger. Here's the bottom line on everything we covered. After January 6th, multiple Republican figures, Phil Scott, John Katko, and 2 Republican senators, publicly demanded Trump's resignation. That established the specific historical template. Republican resignation demands emerge when the political cost calculation produces that conclusion. That is the most directly available empirical precedent for evaluating when the Iran war backlash produces the same threshold crossing. Joe Kent resigned as the most prominent MAGA national security official. He specifically said Iran posed no imminent threat and the war was lobby-driven. That created the specific MAGA-credentialed permission structure that most directly lowers the cost of Republican accountability demands in the electoral environments where that credential is most essential. The Washington Post and The Hill documented deep unease among the no more endless wars wing of Trump's base. The foundational foreign policy promise that the Iran war is most directly violating, creating the base-level MAGA fracture that most specifically generates the political conditions for Republican resignation demands. The New York Times documented Republican leaders blocking basic Iran hearings out of fear of exposing strategic incoherence. That is the most specifically self-defeating available blocking strategy in a midterm environment where 54% voter disapproval is most directly costly to the most vulnerable members. And Trump privately told House Republicans that if they lose the midterms, he will be impeached. The most specific available private confirmation that the Republican protection is the specific remaining shield between the accumulated accountability case and the formal proceedings it most directly supports. The reign ends when Republicans decide the political cost of continued protection exceeds the political cost of the most dramatically available disassociation, and the specific documented convergence of MAGA fracture, historical template, block hearing self-defeating strategy, and midterm survival calculus is most specifically building toward the political cost threshold that historically produces that decision. Stay tuned. The Iran war trajectory is developing. The midterm cycle is intensifying, and we're going to be right here covering every single development as it unfolds.